My father, Richard Vance, was a man who collected things. He collected Art Deco lamps, first edition novels he never read, and a string of admiring friends who were always happy to drink his expensive scotch. Mostly toga. He collected debt. It was his most enduring and varied collection. Acquired with a flair and enthusiasm he applied to everything in his life. He saw debt not as a liability, but as a testament to a life lived fully, a sign that you had squeezed every last drop of credit and goodwill from the world. A financial analyst who spent my days mitigating risk and worshiping at the altar of the balance sheet saw it differently. I saw it as a stain, a legacy of irresponsibility. He died on a Tuesday, a massive, theatrical heart attack. On the 17th hole of a golf course he couldn't afford to be a member of. It was, in every way, a fitting exit, grand, sudden, and leaving a mess for someone else to clean up. I was, of course, that someone else, or so I thought. The reading of the will took place a week later in the office of a man named Bartholomew Jones, a lawyer whose mahogany-paneled office and pinstriped suit were paid for, I suspected, almost entirely, by my father's chaotic financial life. I was there, and so was she. Isabel, the new wife, the final acquisition. Isabel was a masterpiece of grief. She was 32, a full 3 decades younger than my father, and she wore her widowhood like a couture gown. She was draped in elegant black silk, a single perfect tear tracing a path down her cheek at precisely the right moment. She had big, sorrowful green eyes and a way of looking at you that made you feel like you were the only person in the world who could possibly understand the depth of her pain. I knew for a fact my father had met her less than a year ago at a gallery opening where he'd been trying to sell a painting to pay off a gambling marker. It was a whirlwind romance, he told me, a final brilliant blaze of passion. I called it a hostile takeover. Bartholomew cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the quiet, leather-scented room. We are gathered to read the last will and testament of Richard Michael Vance. He began. His voice is somber. Drone. I braced myself. I wasn't expecting much. A watch. Maybe a condescending letter telling me to live a little. My father and I had a relationship built on a series of loans and disappointments. I loved him in the way you love a beautiful, crumbling old building that you know is structurally unsound ... but I didn't particularly like him. The will was short, it was concise, and it was a masterpiece of posthumous cruelty to me. Leo Vance, his only child, had left a small, lacquered box. In this box, Bartholomew Reed, his eyes flicking towards me, you will find a collection of photographs, a reminder that the only things of true value are our memories. I felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. He had to be kidding. And to my beloved wife. Isabel Vance, the lawyer continued, his tone softening as he looked at the weeping widow. I leave the remainder of my estate, both real and personal, in its entirety. Isabel let out a small, choked sob, dabbing at her perfect tear with a lace handkerchief. The remainder of his estate, the grand mortgage to the Hilt House in the hills, the 1968 Jaguar E-Type that spent more time in the shop than on the road, the art collection, which I suspected was 90% clever fakes, and, of course, the collection, the vast, sprawling, multi-layered mountain of debt. Bartholomew closed the folder. That concludes the reading. Isabel rose gracefully. She floated over to me, her expensive perfume filling the air. Leo, said what he spared, placing a cool hand on my arm. I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I told him he should. She trailed off, her voice thick with unshed tears. Save it, Isabella, I said, my voice flat. I pulled my arm away. I stood up and walked over to the lawyer's desk. He slid the lacquered box towards me. It was beautiful. I had to admit ... probably worth a few $100s. I didn't open it. The estate, aside my voice devoid of any emotion, I assume you have a full accounting of its assets and liabilities. Bartholomew looked uncomfortable. We are still in the process of cataloging everything. Leo, your father's finances were complex. I'm sure they were, aside, but you are aware that all outstanding debts must be settled by the estate before any assets can be transferred to a beneficiary. That is the law, is it not? A flicker of something panic, annoyance, crossed Isabel's beautiful face. Bartholomew nodded slowly. Yes, that is standard procedure. Good. Aside, I looked from the lawyer to the grieving widow, because my father had a great many debts, and I intend to call in every single one of them. Starting with the one he owes me, the debt was 5 years old. It was a specter that had haunted every interaction I'd had with my father since. He'd called me in the middle of the night, his voice a cocktail of panic and false bravado. A business opportunity had gone sour, ... An investor had pulled out. The details were always murky. Shrouded in the fog of his relentless optimism, the reality was stark. He was on the verge of losing the house, the one he'd just left to Isabel. He needed $75,000, and he needed it by morning. I was 24, just starting my career, living in a small apartment and carefully building my own financial future on a foundation of discipline. He would have found comical. I had the money. It was my entire life savings, scraped together from bonuses and frugal living, a down payment for a future I was trying to build, one that looked nothing like his. He swore he'd pay me back in 6 months. He'd even, in a moment of shocking foresight, agreed to sign a formal promissory note. I had my own lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Evelyn Reed. Draft date, it was ironclad. ... It specified the principal, a modest but fair interest rate, and a repayment schedule. It was a legally binding document, of course. He never made a single payment. Every time I brought it up, he would laugh it off. Leo, my boy, we're family. Paperwork is just a formality. He'd clap me on the shoulder, buy me an expensive dinner he couldn't afford, and the subject would be dropped. But I never dropped the document. I kept it in a fireproof safe, a cold, hard reminder of the price of being Richard Vance's son. Now, it was my only inheritance. It was my key to the kingdom he had so casually given away. The day after the will reading, I was in Evelyn Reed's office. Her space was the polar opposite of Bartholomew's. It was minimalist, modern, hourglass and style. Evelyn herself with sharp angles and sharper intellect. She listened intently as I recounted the events, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. So, let me get T's strike hit. Your father leaves his entire, likely insolvent, estate to his wife of 10 months. He leaves you a box of photos. And you want to file a creditor's claim against the estate for the $75,000 loan, plus 5 years of accrued interest. That's the gist of it. Aside, Leo, this is going to be ugly. Sour Ned, the widow, Isabel, will ficht it. She paint you as a heartless ghoul picking over your father's corpse. The optics are terrible. I'm not running for office, Evelyn. I countered, I'm collecting a debt. A legally recognized debt that takes precedence over any inheritance. I'm not being a ghoul. I'm being a creditor. It's the one role my father ever truly prepared me for. She studied me for a long moment. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. You know, I think your father would be proud. You're finally thinking like him, using the rules to your advantage. It's a very Vance move. The observation hit me with the force of a physical blow. Was that what this was? Was I just perpetuating the cycle, using the cold logic of finance to settle an emotional score? The thought was unsettling, but I pushed it down. Just file the claim, I said. my voice harder than I intended. Let's see what happens when the grieving widow realizes the mansion is just a pile of IOUs. Evelyn nodded. I'll business again. All right, I'll draw up the notice and serve it to Bartholomew Jones as the executor of the estate. The clock starts now, Isabel. Vance is about to find out that marrying a rich man and inheriting his money are two very different things. As I left her office, the cold knot in my stomach tightened. This wasn't just business. It was war, and I had just fired the first shot. The official notice of my claim landed on Bartholomew Jones's mahogany desk like a grenade. The shrapnel, I soon learned, hit Isabel directly. Her response was swift and predictable. A week after Evelyn filed the paperwork, I received a phone call, an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but curiosity got the better of me. Leo Vance. Anne sweared. My tone clipped. Leo? It's Isabel. Her voice was no longer the soft whisper of the grieving widow. It was sharp, bretelle. The silk had been replaced with steel. I'm surprised you have my number. Aside, don't play games with me. Sesnaped. I got a letter from your lawyer. What is this? What are you trying to do? I'm not trying to do anything, Isabel, I replied, keeping my voice level and calm. It was the voice I used with volatile clients, a tone designed to de-escalate. I'm collecting a debt. The estate is legally obligated to pay its creditors. I just happen to be the first in line. I could hear her sharp intake of breath. This is a shakedown. It's obscene. Your father is barely cold in his grave, and you're sending lawyers after his wife. For some imaginary loan? It's not imaginary, I said coolly. There's a promissory note. Signed, notarized. My father had a flair for the dramatic, but he wasn't a forger. You'll find it's all perfectly legal. This is what he warned me about. Sighed, her voice dripping with venom. / He told me you were cold. That you only cared about money. / He said you couldn't stand to see him happy. The words were a direct hit. They struck a raw nerve I didn't even know was exposed. The idea that he had been talking about me to her, this mere stranger, painting me as the villain in his grand romance. It was a betrayal that felt sharper than the will itself. My father's happiness has nothing to do with it, I said, fighting to keep the emotion out of my voice. This is about a financial agreement. You, of all people, sold Inderstentet. You're the one who inherited the balance sheet. There's nothing, suspect. Do you understand? After the mortgage, the credit cards, there's barely anything left. This house is all I have. So she knew the estate was a house of cards. Her grief, Herr Surprise, it had all been a performance. She wasn't the blindsided widow. She was the last investor in a Ponzi scheme that had finally collapsed. That's not my problem. Isabella, I said, the law is the law. The estate has to be liquidated to pay the debts. If there's nothing left for you after I get what's mine, then maybe you should have done your due diligence before you married him. I hung up before she could respond. My hand was shaking. Evelyn was right. This was ugly. It was personal. Isabel wasn't just going to roll over. She was going to fight, and she was going to use my father's memory as her primary weapon. The battle for his money was becoming inextricably linked with the battle for his legacy, and I was starting to realize that winning one might mean destroying the other. Isabel, true to form, decided to contest the claim. Her lawyer, a slick reptilian man named Marcus Thorne, sent a letter to Evelyn. It was a work of art, full of legal jargon and veiled threats. It argued that the promissory note was invalid, a product of undue influence. It painted a picture of me as a manipulative son taking advantage of his aging, emotionally vulnerable father. It was a complete fabrication, but it was just plausible enough to be dangerous. They're trying to drag it out, Evelyn explained over the phone. They know the claim is valid, but they're hoping to bury us in legal fees and delays. They want you to get tired and walk away with a lowball settlement. I'm not settling aside. I want what I'm owed, all of it. Gut, Evelyn said, because their next move will be to demand an official appraisal and liquidation of all estate assets. They're hoping the numbers are so low it won't be worth the fight for you. Let them, I replied. I want to see the look on her face when the appraiser tells her the Renoir is a print. From the museum gift shop, the liquidation process began. It was a slow, methodical dismantling of my father's life. Every object he had collected, every testament to his supposed good taste, was to be examined, appraised, and assigned a monetary value. As the primary creditor, I had the right to be present for the appraisals to ensure everything was above board. It was an opportunity I savored. I met the appraiser, a fussy, meticulous man named Arthur. At Jose, Isabel was there, a thunderous expression on her beautiful face. She trailed us from room to room, her arms crossed, watching as Arthur examined each item with a jeweler's loupe and a weary sigh. It was a bloodbath. The collection of antique French furniture in the living room. Good quality reproductions, Arthur declared, from the 90s, the shelves of first edition books in the library. Mostly book club editions, I'm afraid. And the art. Oh, te art. My father had fancied himself a connoisseur. The walls were covered in what he claimed were minor works by major artists. A sketch by Dali, a lithograph by Chagall. A small abstract he hinted was an early Pollock. Arthur was merciless ... The signature is all wrong on the Dali. The paper on the Chagall is modern. And this, Hussein, tapping the supposed Pollock, is a very enthusiastic but very amateur work, quite decorative but worthless. With each pronouncement, I could feel Isabel's despair radiating across the room. Her inheritance was shrinking before her eyes. The grand illusion my father had built was being stripped away, board by board, revealing the cheap, rotten wood beneath. The only item of significant value was the car, the 1968 Jaguar, E-Type in British racing green. It was his pride and joy, the one thing he had maintained with genuine care. It was appraised at a value that would cover about half of my claim. After Arthur left, the house felt cavernous and empty. The art on the walls, now exposed as fraudulent, seemed to mock us. Isabel stood in the middle of the living room, looking not at me, but at the space where a particular large, fake landscape used to hang. Are you happy now, Leo? C'est esque, her voice hollow. This has nothing to do with happiness, I said, sticking to my mantra. It's an accounting. He loved this house. Say, he spared. He loved all these things. They were his story. His story was a fiction. I countered ... built on bad credit and other people's money. I'm just adding the final chapter. It's called The Reckoning. I left her there, alone in the house of lies. I felt a grim sense of satisfaction, but it was tainted with something else. Something that felt uncomfortably like pity. I was winning, but the victory felt like I was foreclosing on. A ghost, the liquidation of the estate dragged on. It was a slow, bureaucratic process of death by 1,000 paper cuts. Auction houses were contacted. Estate sale companies consulted. Every asset had to be inventoried, cataloged, and prepared for sale. And as the primary creditor, I found myself in the bizarre position of being the de facto executor of my own father's life. Bartholomew Jones, the official executor, was happy to let me take the lead. He was a man who specialized in creating wills, not dismantling them. He seemed overwhelmed by the sheer chaos of my father's financial affairs. So, I was the one who spent weekends in that house, going through closets, opening drawers, sorting a lifetime of accumulated possessions into 2 piles, cell and tress. Isabel was rarely there. She had, according to her lawyer, taken a small apartment in the city, unable to bear the emotional toll of watching the house be dismantled. I knew it was because the utilities were about to be shut off. It was a strange, almost obscene intimacy. I was going through my father's things in a way I never could when he was alive. I found his collection of silk ties, each one more flamboyant than the last. I found a drawer full of unpaid parking tickets. I found old love letters from women whose names I didn't recognize, tucked away in a shoebox at the back of his closet. And then I found the box he had left me, the lacquered box of photographs. It was on the mantelpiece, exactly where Isabel had left it after the will reading. I had refused to take it with me, saying it était ultimate insult, a box of memories to a man who dealt in numbers. Now, surrounded by the detritus of his life, I picked it up. It felt heavy. I opened the lid. It was full of old photos, just as the will had promised. My father in his 20s, young and impossibly handsome, leaning against a sports car I'd never seen. My mother, who had divorced him when I was 10 and fled to the other side of the country, smiling a genuine, unforced smile. And me, dozens of pictures of me as a baby, me on my first day of school, dwarfed by my backpack, me at my high school graduation, looking awkward in my cap and gown, my father's arm slung around my shoulder, a proud, beaming grin on his face, a photo I barely remembered being taken. I sat on the floor of his dusty, half-empty study. The photos spread out around me. These weren't just random snapshots. Someone had carefully curated them. They told a story, the story of a father and a son, a story that was far more complicated than the simple narrative of neglect and disappointment I had constructed for myself. Beneath the photos, at the very bottom of the box, was a single, folded piece of paper. It was not a letter. It was a receipt from a high-end art gallery, dated 6 months after I had given him the loan. It was for the sale of a small, bronze sculpture. The price was $80,000. $80,000. He'd had more than enough money to pay me back, and he hadn't. The warmth I had felt looking at the photos instantly evaporated, replaced by a familiar, cold fury. This was the man he was. He would sell a sculpture for a fortune. And instead of paying his debt to his own son, he would buy more things, throw more parties, dig the hole even deeper. I crumpled the receipt in my fist. / The photos, the memories. They were just another one of his tricks, another bit of sentimental misdirection to distract from the cold. Haired numbers, and the numbers didn't lie. He had betrayed me, again. The discovery of the art sale receipt hardened something in me. Any flicker of sympathy I'd felt for my father, any sentimental weakness brought on by those old photographs, was extinguished. This was no longer just about getting my money back. It was about proving a point. It was about showing him, even in death, that his actions had consequences. The estate sale was scheduled for a Saturday. The house was filled with strangers, picking over the remnants of Richard Vance's life like vultures. They pawed at the fake paintings, haggled over the reproduction furniture, and offered cents on the dollar for his collection of flamboyant silk ties. I stood in a corner of the living room, watching it all with a kind of detached horror. Isabel was there, a spectral presence in the corner, her face a pale, tight-knit mask. We didn't speak. We just watched as his legacy was sold off, piece by piece, for a fraction of what he had told the world it was worth. The car was the main event. The Jaguar E-Type. It was parked in the driveway, gleaming in the sun, a lone beacon of genuine value in a sea of artifice. A small crowd of collectors and enthusiasts had gathered to bid on it. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man with a clipboard, stared at Debt-Ridden. It was a brief, fierce battle. The price climbed quickly, surpassing the appraiser's estimate. I found myself holding my breath. Every $1,000 was another piece of my loan being repaid. Another step toward financial, if not emotional, Vindication, the final price was $110,000. A respectable sum, combined with the meager proceeds from the house contents, it was enough to cover my entire claim. Principal and interest, with a little left. Over after the auctioneer's gavel fell, a man approached me. He was one of the smaller creditors, a local tailor to whom my father had owed a few $1,000s for a series of custom suits he'd never paid for. "So, you did it," the tailor said, a grudging respect in his voice. "You got your money. I did. Aside, I guess that makes you the only one of us who will." Ha sighed with Haseja. "By the time the lawyers in the auction house take their cut, there won't be anything left for the rest of us, ... or the widow." He walked away, leaving me alone with my victory. I had won. I had called in the debt, and the debt had been paid. I had beaten Isabel, beaten my father's ghost. I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt nothing, just a vast, hollow emptiness. The number in my bank account would change, but nothing else would. The anger, the resentment, the years of disappointment, they were all still there, untouched. I looked over at Isabel. She was talking to her lawyer, her expression defeated. She had lost everything. The house, the car, the life she had married into. She caught my eye from across the driveway. There was no hatred in her gaze, just a profound, bottomless exhaustion. In that moment, I didn't see a rival or a con artist. I saw another victim of Richard Vance's charm, another person who had believed the story, only to be crushed by the reality. We were the last two members of his collection, the final two creditors left standing in the ruins of his life, and we had both lost. The final step in the liquidation process was clearing out the house before the new owners took possession. The estate sale had emptied it of anything valuable, but what remained was the personal detritus, the things no one would buy, boxes of old papers, clothes, the intimate clutter of a life. As the claimant who had forced the sale, the grim task of final disposal fell to me. I spent a Sunday at the house, surrounded by black trash bags and cardboard boxes. The place echoed with every footstep, every rustle of paper. There was a mausoleum, and I was its reluctant caretaker. My goal was to be ruthless, to get it done quickly, but my father's life was not so easily dismissed. In his study, in a locked filing cabinet that the estate sale crew had ignored, I found what I was looking for, or rather, what I wasn't looking for. I left her standing alone in the empty house, a ghost among ghosts. The war was over, and it turned out there were no winners. The final checks arrived a week later. A cashier's check from the escrow company for the sale of the house made out to the estate of Richard Vance, and a check from the auction house for the sale of his belongings. It was a significant amount of money. I met Evelyn at her office to sign the final papers. The money would be transferred to the estate's account. From there, Evelyn would pay the legal fees, the auction house commission, the outstanding credit card bills, the tailor, and then she would cut a check to me for the full amount of my claim plus interest ... And what's left for the widow? I asked. As I signed my name for the last time, Evelyn consulted a spreadsheet. After your claim is settled, and after we set aside a contingency for any other creditors who might pop up, it looks like there will be about $5,000. $5,000. That's what Isabel's inheritance amounted to. That's what was left of my father's grand legacy. A used car's worth of cash. I'll have the check sent to her lawyer, Evelyn said, stacking the papers neatly ... And that, Leo, is that you did it. You got what you were owed. I walked out of her office and into the bright afternoon sun. My phone buzzed. It was a transfer alert from my bank. A large deposit had been made. The number stared back at me from the screen. The number I had fought so hard for. It meant nothing. The victory was hollow. The money in my account was just money. It couldn't undo the years of resentment. It couldn't fill the hole my father had left. I went home to my quiet, orderly apartment. The lacquered box was on my coffee table. I had brought it home with me from the house, along with the journals. I opened the box and took out the photos. I looked at the picture of my father with his arm around me at my graduation, his face split in a wide, proud grin. Who was this man? This stranger who had been my father. This man of secrets and lies and desperate, the boundless love. I opened one of the journals. His familiar, looping script filled the page. It was a story, not the fiction he had sold to the world, but a real story. A story of regret and hope, of failure and ambition. It was the story of a man I was only just beginning to meet. My inheritance. It really, Zid, wasn't the money in my bank account. It was this box of photos. And a dozen leather-bound books. It was the messy, complicated, infuriating, and heartbreaking truth. My father had left me with a mountain of debt, not the financial kind. That I had collected. He had left me with the debt of understanding, the debt of forgiveness, .. And as I sat there in the quiet of my apartment, I finally understood. It was the debt I would spend the rest of my life trying to repay. I had to pry the lock open with a crowbar. Inside were not stock certificates or hidden assets. They were journals, a dozen leather-bound books, filled with my father's elegant, looping handwriting, and next to them, a series of thick manila folders, his financial records, the real ones. I sat on the floor and began to read. The story they told was not the one I knew. The financial records were a disaster. Yes, a chaotic mess of bad investments and frivolous spending, but there was a pattern. Starting about 2 years ago, the pattern had changed. There were new folders. Medical bills, oncologists, experimental treatments. My father had been sick. He had been dying, and he had told no one. The knot in my stomach, the one that had been there for months, turned to ice. I felt back to my last few conversations with him. He'd seemed tired, yes, but he was always tired after a late night. He'd lost weight, but he joked it was his new scotch and stress diet. He had been hiding it masterfully. Behind the same curtain of charm and bravado, he hid everything else behind. Then I opened the journals. The recent entries were chilling. He wrote about the pain, his fear, the exhaustion. He wrote about his desperate attempts to secure a legacy, to turn his fake art and mortgaged house into something real, something of value. He was racing against a clock I didn't even know was ticking. Isabel is a spark of light in the darkness. One entry read, "She deserves a soft landing. She doesn't know how little time we have." He hadn't been a fool, duped by a young, beautiful woman. He had been a dying man, clinging to a last shred of happiness. And then I found the entry that shattered me. It was dated the week after he sold the bronze sculpture. The sale that had so enraged me. 80,000, a small fortune. Enough to finally make Leo whole, but I can't give it to him. Not yet. The doctors say this new treatment might work. It's expensive, a long shot, but if it works, if it buys me more time, I can turn this 80 into 180. I can pay him back with interest and still have something left for Isabel. It's a gamble, but my whole life has been a gamble. This is the last hand I'll ever play. I'm betting on the house. I'm betting on myself ... For him, I dropped the journal as if it had burned me. He hadn't spent the money on parties or tithe. He had spent it on doctors, on a desperate, futile attempt to live, and his plan, his final, reckless, terrible plan, had been for me. He was trying to pay me back, not with the 75,000 I had given him, but with a fortune he was convinced he could conjure from thin air. He hadn't been betraying me. He had been trying, in his own flawed, grandiose way, to provide for me, and then I saw it, tucked into the back of a journal. A document, a formal amendment to his will. It was dated a month before his death. It stated that, in the event of his passing, the Jaguar E-Type was to be sold immediately, and the proceeds, up to $100,000, were to be transferred directly to me, Leo Vance, to settle their outstanding financial agreement. It was signed by him, and it was witnessed by two people. One was his lawyer, Bartholomew Jones. The other was Isabel Vance. She had known about the car, about his intention to pay me back. She had known, and she had said nothing. She had let me go through this entire ugly, soul-destroying process. She had let me become the villain, the grief I should have felt for my father was instantly eclipsed by a white-hot, blinding rage directed at her. She hadn't just been a passive victim. She had been an active co-conspirator in his final tragic deception, and she had deliberately, maliciously concealed the one thing that would have changed everything. The house was sold. The keys were to be handed over to the new owners the next day. I called Isabel. Meet me at the house. Aside. There was no room for argument. And my voice, one last time. She was there when I arrived. She was standing in the empty living room, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the bare floorboards. The space, stripped of my father's possessions, looked smaller, sadder. She looked tired. / The fight was gone from her eyes. What do you want, Leo? See, Isked, there's nothing left to take. I didn't say anything. I just walked over to the fireplace and placed one of the leather-bound journals on the mantelpiece, then the amendment to the will. Her eyes widened when she saw it. She knew what it was. He was trying to pay me back. Aside, my voice dangerously quiet the whole time. He had a plan, a stupid, reckless, doomed to fail plan. But it was a plan, and you knew about it. She looked away, staring at a spot on the wall. He made me promise not to tell you. So he spared. He was so sure he was going to beat it. The illness. He thought he'd have time to make it all right. He didn't want you to know he was sick. I was proud. He didn't want your pity. My pity. I let out a short, bitter laugh. I wouldn't have pitied him. I might have. I don't know. I might have been there. I might have helped. We'll never know. We'll where? Because you decided to honor the wishes of a dying, delusional man instead of telling the truth. I took a step closer. But that's not the whole story. Is it, Isabel? Because after he died, you still said nothing. You could have shown me this. I tapped the document, and it all would have been over. The car would have been sold. Ted Debt would have been paid. But you didn't. You let me tear his life apart. You let me become the monster. Why? She finally looked at me. Her eyes were swimming with tears, but they weren't the performative tears I had seen before. These were real. They were raw, because I deserved something. Seb burst out, her voice cracking. I loved him. I took care of him. For 10 months, I was the one who held his hand, who listened to his stories, who watched him get weaker every day while he pretended to be strong. And what was I left with? A pile of bills and a fake painting. That car. It was the only thing of real value. It was my only chance to have something, anything to show for it. Her confession hung in the air between us. It was ugly and selfish and desperately, tragically human. She wasn't a cold, calculating gold digger. She was a woman who had gambled on a dying man and lost. Just like the rest of us. So you buried the well. Aside, the anger draining out of me, replaced by a profound, weary sadness. You contested my claim, hoping I'd go away. You were willing to let me think the absolute worst of my own father, just so you could have a payday. Sorry, Say whispered, the words barely audible. Leo, I am so sorry. I looked at her. The grieving widow, the last acquisition, and I realized the truth. My father hadn't collected things. He had collected people who were drawn to his light, his charm, his promise of a beautiful life, and in the end, had left us Alin to Derek, fighting over the scraps. It doesn't matter anymore. Aside, I picked up the journal and the will amendment and walked towards the door. The estate is settled.